This $300 Acer Chromebook certainly isn't a performance powerhouse, but I've got to say it offers some pretty good value, and honestly, it's pretty capable in its own right. Now, Chromebooks have had a pretty dismal reputation for pretty much as long as they've existed, and it's kind of for a good reason. They really just target the low end of the market. It kind of fulfills the same role that netbooks fulfilled, in case any of you remember those. You know, very low end, cheap laptops. It doesn't tend to endear much positivity. Unfortunately, there's a flaw as to how cheap a laptop can be, because, you know, all of them need cases, screens, keyboard, trackpads, processors, storage, memory, so on. So you end up finding that a $300 laptop or $200 laptop is a lot worse than a $400 laptop, even though the price difference is, on a relative basis, not that much. But Acer's Chromebook Plus 514 has got me thinking that maybe a $300 laptop isn't so bad nowadays. And to be clear, I'm a person that hasn't used a laptop that costs less than $1,000 in, like, I don't know, it's been almost a decade. $300, it might be good now though. The Plus 514 is a 14-inch Chromebook with a 1080p IPS display with touch functionality, a 10 keyless keyboard, and what I consider to be a fairly small touchpad. The chassis is made of plastic, but it feels pretty sturdy, and I think the finish looks pretty good. I actually keep thinking this is an aluminum chassis until I touch it and remember it's just plastic. The internal hardware components aren't super fancy either. The processor inside the Plus 514 is Intel's Core i3 N305 from the 12th gen Alder Lake lineup, which is actually a pretty interesting CPU because it's got 8 E cores and no P cores. It's basically what you'd get if you disabled all the P cores on a Core i9 12900K and then power limited them. It's really nice to see such a cheap CPU have 8 cores, but it's worth bearing in mind that an Alder Lake E core is about equivalent to a regular Skylake core from 2015. There's also no hyperthreading, so there's just 8 threads rather than 16. The N305 is paired with 8 GB of LPDDR5 memory and a 128 GB SSD, which isn't super big, but is probably fine for a $300 laptop. There's also a Wi-Fi 6E card installed, something that you can't take for granted in this segment of the market. As for ports, on the left side we have a USB Type-C port with charging and display port, a USB Type-A port, a micro SD card slot, and a headphone jack. On the other side, there's another USB Type-C port with charging and display port, and a USB Type-A port. That's not a ton, but it is reasonable for a cheap 14-inch laptop. On paper, this is all pretty good so far, especially considering that most laptops in the $300-ish price range really don't have as good as hardware as this. Now, of course, there are other laptops around this price point that have an N305 or a roughly equivalent chip or better from Intel or AMD, but hey, this is definitely in the upper crust. Now, reviewing a budget Chromebook did give me a little bit of whiplash because my main laptop is the ROG Flow X13, which costs over $1,000, and the chip inside the Ryzen 9 7940HS is a few times faster than the N305. But nevertheless, I could honestly see myself getting the Plus 514 if my laptop ever got stolen again, so I don't bankrupt myself. The typing and swiping experience on the Plus 514 wasn't exactly good, however. The keyboard felt pretty good when I typed on it, but at times I really just couldn't get up to speed. Sometimes I'd make errors for some reason. Other times my hand would just be one key over, and I really couldn't figure out why, but it did feel good to type on when I wasn't making mistakes. Maybe I needed to spend more time with it, but I've had plenty of laptops where this wasn't really an issue. Also, I'm really not a huge fan of this layout. The top row is sort of the function key row on a normal keyboard, which is fine, except there's a go back button for internet browsers that I really don't find very useful. And then towards the bottom left side, we have a truly strange configuration. Where the caps lock key normally is, there's Google's version of the Windows key, and then the bottom left just has 2 really big Control and Alt keys. This layout makes very little sense to me. It's purely a downgrade from any other mainstream keyboard on a laptop. I've pressed the circle key, or whatever you want to call it, several times by accident, whisking me away from whatever I was doing and typing before. That all being said, the keyboard was fine. It's the touchpad I have significant issues with. Firstly, it's pretty small, and I know that's pretty typical for cheap laptops, but I don't think cheap laptops have to come with small trackpads. Now, once I turned off mouse acceleration, the touchpad became much more tolerable for me, until I tried right-clicking things. The first time I tried to right-click something was in the File Manager app, and I figured maybe there wasn't a right-click menu for some reason because one didn't pop up, but then I realized that right-clicking did nothing anywhere. As it turns out, there's no physical right-click button on the Plus 514 because Chromebooks just don't have right-clicks on their touchpads, which is, it's not Acer's fault, but that's just incredibly confusing to me. I don't know why that's a thing. Like, instead of right clicking, you have to tap using two fingers, which is fine. I think you can also alt and left click, and that's also fine, I guess, but why not just have a right click button? I really don't understand this design choice coming from Google. But putting the keyboard and mouse aside, the general experience on the Plus 514 was pretty good. I didn't expect too much from this laptop given its specs, but honestly it ran pretty decently. The N305 is relatively weak but not anemic, so navigating Chrome OS and browsing the web were both fairly smooth. And since web browsing is a major component of what makes a Chromebook, it's good that this is something that the Plus 514 gets right. But the thing I enjoyed the most was the battery life. I had the Plus 514 run a 4K YouTube video for as long as it possibly could until it died, and it lasted for over 7 hours. This result is actually significantly better than what I saw on my Flow X13, which died an hour and a half quicker. The Flow X13 has a battery that's roughly 50% larger, so the Plus 514 is running really efficiently here. That's not too surprising considering that we're talking about the N305, a very low-end E-core only CPU, versus AMD's top-end Ryzen 7000 APU. But that is one of the benefits of going with a lower-end chip. But one of the craziest things I experienced with this Chromebook is that I left it alone for a full day and the battery life did not change, maybe even 1%. I'm pretty sure it was the exact same percentage it was when I first put it away. That is not something that I get with my Flow X13 by any means. So this is something that I was very happy to see. It's really a testament to Chrome OS, Linux, and Intel that this is all possible on a $300 laptop. Now, I had wanted to run a lot of performance tests on this Chromebook, but unfortunately, with the fact that this thing is running Chrome OS and it's not only based on Linux, but a very custom version of Linux, I wasn't able to get most of my benchmarks up and running. However, there were a few tests that are compatible with Chrome OS, and I will show those right now. Geekbench 6 has both a CPU and a GPU test that we're going to be looking at here, but first up is the CPU test, which assesses general CPU performance in both multi-threaded and single-threaded workloads. In the multi-threaded test, the Flow X13 is unsurprisingly way out in the lead here with nearly 3 times the performance of the Plus 514. But it's using a Ryzen 9 7940HS, which is considerably more expensive and beefier than the N305. Meanwhile, the quad-core DEC APU is about as fast as the N305. The DEC's processor is roughly equivalent to Mendocino models in the Ryzen 7020 series, so I think it's pretty good for Intel that the N305 is matching that. Single-threaded performance is fine on the N305, it's a little bit behind the DEC APU and very far behind the 7940HS, but the gap is smaller than in the multi-threaded test. Graphics are certainly a weak spot for the N305, but we do need to keep in mind that the DEC APU has an unusually large integrated GPU, and that the 7940HS is of course very high-end. The result isn't ideal for the Plus 514, but it is at least tolerable. In speedometer, a web browser benchmark we ran in Google Chrome, the DEC APU and the N305 are roughly neck and neck, and about half as fast as the 7940HS. Not a bad result for the Acer Chromebook in my opinion. The last thing I tested were games, because Steam is actually now supported in Chrome OS and it was easy to get running. I ended up installing a few games that I thought the N305 might be able to run pretty decently, because can a game is kind of an important question to ask about any PC. However, Chrome OS is a Linux distro, and a fairly locked down one at that. I would normally use Mango Head for frame rate recording since I've used it on the Steam Deck before, but I just couldn't get it to work, and I'm also not a fan of not having a UI for navigating non-ChromeOS files, so I'm just going to rate games on whether they're playable or not. Given the processor this Chromebook has, plus the fact that not every game has a native Linux port, the games I chose were mostly 2D or older 3D games. 2D games that ran well were The Binding of Isaac Rebirth, Enter the Gungeon, and FTL. Not too surprising since all of these games are pixelated and can probably run on much weaker hardware. Surprisingly, Terraria ran pretty poorly, and I get that it's a much different game than it was a decade ago, but still, it's a 2D game with pixel assets. I had wanted to reduce the resolution to get it to run better, but in full screen it bugged out whenever I tried to play at any resolution other than 1080p, and in window mode the resolution determined the window size. I guess it's playable at 1080p, but honestly, it's not a good experience. This is not the Chromebook to get for any Terraria fan. The Plus 514 also sort of struggled to run Europa Universalis 4, one of the 3D games I tried. The frame rate was pretty good when the game was paused, but when the game was running, the frame rate dropped to like maybe about a dozen or so frames per second. Thankfully, the game did progress pretty quickly through each day, as this is sort of a turn-based game, but each turn is a single day, and each day on average took maybe about half a second, which is pretty decent at the maximum speed possible. However, Civilization 5 ran pretty decently, and it kind of gave me a throwback to when I played Civ 5 on my terrible Toshiba satellite, except with this laptop, I could actually afford to run some settings above the minimum. But one game that ran surprisingly well was Skyrim, not the special edition re-release, but the original. I was able to get 60 FPS at 720p resolution and low settings, which didn't look good by any means, but it was a smooth 60 FPS. And throughout all my games testing, I was actually on the battery and not the charger, so it's good to know that you're getting the full performance out of the Plus 514 even without the charger. Finally, a few words on Chrome OS and what I thought about it while using the Plus 514. Firstly, I think it's perfectly fine for the average user. I really am not a fan of this whole right-click not existing thing, but I think most people can use Chrome OS just fine and not really be that limited. And I feel like the major reason someone might not like Chrome OS is simply because if they prefer Windows or perhaps Mac OS. I do think the lack of Chrome OS support on certain apps will bother some. Now, Linux does kind of struggle with this on its own, and Chrome OS is based on Linux, and lots of these, run-of-the-mill consumer apps are mostly made for Windows and sometimes Mac OS, but I feel like Chrome OS kind of exacerbates that problem with what Google does with Chrome OS. Essentially, Chrome OS is locked down to a surprising degree for a Linux distro. Some of the things that I tried on the Plus 514, such as installing Mango HUD, simply didn't work, even though it would have worked just fine on any other Linux installation. I had two main issues. Firstly, the terminal isn't actually the real terminal. It's some kind of proxy external terminal, and I wasn't able to do some things because it would throw out an error, say, this is an external terminal, you can't do that, which made installing Mango HUD basically impossible as far as I could tell. Also, in the Chrome OS file manager, you have your downloads. There's even a Linux folder, but that Linux folder doesn't contain like the actual Linux core files. For example, your root, your user, your bin, your whatever. So it was essentially impossible to navigate using a user interface, like a graphical user interface. Like a file manager, like File Explorer. So what I had to do was use terminal, the cd command. If you are familiar with that, I had to manually type in the file directory that I wanted to access and then manually launch files or whatnot using the terminal, which was really annoying. I'm not a huge fan of that. It's just, it's very inconvenience. I mean, it's why we have graphical interfaces now. Of course, the average user probably isn't going to use the terminal at all, but it would be a nice thing for Chrome OS to have a deeper, more compatible relationship with the Linux software ecosystem. It'd be nice to have support for Snap or Flatpak on Chrome OS. I really don't see why it shouldn't. Now, the Google Play Store sort of fills this hole, but a lot of those apps are specifically made for Android phones and not Chrome OS. So even if they are technically compatible and you can download them, sometimes they won't work super well. Like 3D Mark for Android didn't work on Chrome OS as far as I can tell. At least it didn't work on this specific Chromebook. And the unfortunate truth is that although there are a lot of people using Chrome OS, there aren't enough Chrome OS users for developers to really justify making a Chrome OS specific version of their app. And sometimes, even when there is native Chrome OS support for an app, it doesn't always work out in your favor. For example, Minecraft. There is a Chrome OS Bedrock edition, but you have to purchase it separately. If you already own the Java version or the Bedrock version, too bad, you need to buy yet another copy of Minecraft, like you would for the PS5 or the Switch. And this actually prevented me from running Minecraft on the Plus 514. I'd actually wanted to test it because it's such an easy game to run and it's super popular. This thing would be a great Minecraft machine for, almost anyone, at least I would assume so. I couldn't see for myself because I couldn't test it because I wasn't willing to fork over another $15 or $20 to Microsoft just to have another copy of a game that I'm literally never going to open ever again. Honestly, I think Acer is being held back by Chrome OS here. Except for battery life, there's really not any other way that I can think of that benefits Acer in this situation. What is Chrome OS doing to make this $300 laptop any better besides for battery life? Now, thankfully, Chrome OS does not ruin the Chromebook Plus 514. It's actually a pretty good laptop, all things considered, especially for its $300 price tag, which is pretty low, and I feel like this hardware is pretty good for what you get. For those reasons, we give this laptop a thumbs up. If you enjoyed our review, then please like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, and click the bell icon to get notified the next time we upload. If you want to support the channel, then please donate to our Patreon. We've been doing this for free since September. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.